Thank you very much for the invitation to be here and to be part of this ongoing conversation, which I am sure will be an unfinished one, which we will continue with, I hope, in the years to come. I'm rather envious, I have to say, of the having heard from your minister. I tell you, if only we had a minister like that in Britain, things would look very different. We have, unfortunately, an extremely right-wing government who are positively regressive on the kinds of questions that we're discussing this morning. So we have to be all too aware all the time of the ups and downs, the many turns which take place in relation to state policies on these issues, and the funding, therefore, which is available, etc. Well, I've got a lot to tell you about and not much time to tell it. For a long time, for many decades, there's been a struggle in the United Kingdom to make race and slavery central to British history, politics, and society. And this long-term issue is even more urgent today, given Brexit and its very damaging effects on the situation in Britain. We have a situation with increasing numbers of incidents of racial hatred and racial discrimination, and a very ugly situation. The majority view of Brexit is that the key issue was immigration, and that the fear of others is at the heart of this turn towards protectionism, towards insularity, and away from Europe. I have to say, I felt like weeping coming through the passport control yesterday, and thinking that in the future I'm not going to be a European citizen. It is completely awful and bleak. So, our problem in Britain is the forgetting of the slavery business and slavery, and the assumption that it's something that happened somewhere else. It's something that happened either in the Caribbean or in the United States. Race isn't integral to Britain. Well, of course, race is integral to Britain. And so the effort to reinterpret that history has been what I and many colleagues have been involved with for many years. But a further problem for us is that what's been remembered is abolition. And this relates to the discussion that's just been taking place, because abolition is seen in Britain as part of what's called the golden thread of English liberty. And the problem about that golden thread is that there are many different positions amongst abolitionists, and not all abolitionists are outside of racial thinking. So that we have to be very, very careful about what abolition means. And it's been a difficulty for us that every kind of politician, even the leading members of UKIP, will refer to the importance of the abolition of slavery. So it's, Magna Carta, the Great Reform Bill of 1832, and the abolition of slavery, as if this is all part of one progressive movement in history. Well, sadly, as we know, abolition did not resolve the problems of race, and what happened after abolition was the reconfiguration of racial thinking in the context of no longer having slavery as the condition which secured it. So new ideas, new theorizations of the necessity of racial difference had to be established in the period after abolition. So central to us are these connected issues of forgetting and what gets remembered, but also what I would call the whole question of disavowal, the denial of this central aspect of British history, which is the exclusion of others. And sometimes the key group are the descendants of the enslaved, sometimes they're the Chinese, sometimes they're Jewish, but that problem of otherness has been an ongoing, sometimes they're Irish, an ongoing problem for us. So disavowal, what is both known and not known, what is denied, what is constantly denied and yet erupts in all kinds of different ways. So the project that I've been involved with for the last 7 years is the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project, and it's part of a much wider struggle amongst educationalists, teachers, curators, artists, people who make television programs. You know, there's a lot of us in one way or another, all concerned with the undoing of racial representation. I would see that as central to what we are trying to do. And our aim in the Legacies project is to put the slavery business back into the mainstream of British history and society, to understand the slavery business as one of the cornerstones of our modern world. I want people to understand the extent to which slavery was, in fact, a homegrown product for Britain. It wasn't something that belonged somewhere else. That sugar, which became so central to the iconic British cup of tea, is in a way a good representation of that, the internal nature of slavery. You can't drink a cup of sweet tea without actually being connected to that whole slavery business. The insistence on remembering is to do with the insistence that slavery and its consequences are not in the past. They live on with us in the present, in the contemporary inequalities, which are, of course, as we all know, increasing, with the persistent privileges that have belonged to whiteness and the persistent poverty of the Caribbean. What David Scott refers to slavery as a constituting condition for ill-gotten European prosperity. So it's that insistence on the past in the present, which is, of course, your title for this event today, that we are very committed to. So our strategy in the particular research and educational and outreach project that we're involved with has been to focus on the slave owners. And we're focusing on the slave owners because that brings white men and women, mostly men, but also women, that brings those owners right into the center of an understanding of the slavery business. And our first project was to look at the compensation records, which were the records of the compensation. I'm not sure if I know how to work this. Yeah. This is our database. So we've created a database of the 46,000 individuals who received compensation when slavery was abolished in the British Caribbean, Mauritius, and the Cape. And of these 46,000, we've followed biographically, insofar as we can, the roughly 3,500 people resident in Britain at that time who received compensation. And although the £20 million in compensation, which was equivalent to about 16 billion in today's money, although that money was divided between all the 46,000 claimants, nearly half of it stayed in Britain and was therefore received by a very small number of people. So most of the owners in the Caribbean and Mauritius and the Cape were owners of far fewer enslaved people than those in Britain. So we've identified the people in Britain and we've worked on their financial, their commercial, their cultural, their historical and their political legacies. And our database contains an enormous amount of information which you can search very, very easily. And it has been extraordinarily widely used, I'm very happy to say, both by descendants of the enslaved, who are not always happy to find out the complicated and entangled connections with themselves and white owners, and by the descendants, of course, of the slave owners. And one of the most important things that I think this opens up is precisely the entanglement, which demonstrates so clearly that this is not your history, it is our history, the ways in which we are all implicated in that history. And there have been very important moments when significant British public figures have found out, descendants of the enslaved, have found out the ways in which they're entangled with, of course, the sexual interrelations that were going on, of course, in the Caribbean. And they see that their history is also a white history, just as black people see that their history is also a white history. So there is no binary division, which is what the slave owners tried to make. There is no simple binary division between black and white. It is a shared history. So the second phase of our project has been, as was mentioned in the introduction, to go backwards from 1833, from the moment of abolition, and look at British slave ownership in the Caribbean over the period from 1763, when the British Empire greatly expanded, up to 1833. And that's what we've been doing for the last few years. And it is an absolutely major task, actually. But we recently were able to make public on our database the next phase of our work. And one of the things that we've been able to do, and I know we've had connections for a long time with friends in the Netherlands who've been doing similar things in Suriname, we've been able to map the slave owners onto our web maps and locate the estates of these slave owners and follow what we call the estate evolutions insofar as we can, using the slave registers, using other kinds of title deeds to show the continuity or discontinuity amongst these slave owners. So this particular example that I'm showing you of Lucky Valley in the island of Jamaica in the area, the parish of Clarendon, is the 1 minute, oh my goodness me. Well, I just have to tell you this. Lucky Valley is the estate of Edward Long, who is the most significant historian of Jamaica in the 18th century, and one of the architects, one of the people who was the first to theorize and articulate racial difference as essential difference. And he is the figure that I'm currently researching myself. So this is one of his estates in Clarendon, and on the web, of course, it's all active, but I can't do that here. So these are the kinds of estate evolutions we are showing in relation to the slave owners across the Caribbean, demonstrating what was being produced when, how many enslaved, when we can do that, when we have the slave registers. And just to show you also, okay, this is our mapping of the United Kingdom with the homes of the slave owners. And again, you can click on the name or the place, and you can find details about these people. This is the area around University College in London where it turns out, enormous numbers of slave owners lived. So one of the projects which we've enjoyed the most was an exhibition which we did in University College, which is very proud of its liberal connections from its foundation. And when we discovered that slave owners lived all up and down Gower Street and all in the squares around University College, this was quite an interesting discovery. So we did an exhibition called The Slave Owners of Bloomsbury, which was a rather good counterpoint to all the liberal intellectuals who are very well known who have lived in Bloomsbury. And it was something that had a big effect on our students as they walked in the corridors of University College and saw the numbers of slave owners that lived there, together with, of course, Mary Prince, whose memoir we have of the autobiography of Mary Prince, an enslaved woman in the Caribbean who escaped into the house of an abolitionist in Bloomsbury also. So entangled histories which we've been able to open up and work with museums, with artists, with teachers, and with community groups to spread this knowledge with television, with radio, and so on. We've tried to work all the time with the public and to expand knowledge of the meanings of the slavery business in contemporary Britain. Thank you.